interrupt this program to bring you Courage, the Cowardly Dog Month.
Whole month of Courage, the Cowardly Dog. First appearing in 1996, it was picked up by Cartoon Network, who work in the middle of Burbank, and directed by cartoonist John Dilworth. Though many years have passed since the original air date, it's now time for Zack to celebrate this great show.
Well, old sport, what do you think? Neat. Hey guys, Zack here, and welcome back to Courage Month. So, today's episodes we're going to be reviewing are Mondo Magic and Watch the Birdies. So, let's get into both of those. Okay, so this first episode, Mondo Magic, is very interesting in that Courage has a kind of a magic off with the main antagonist, and Courage is just revealed to be very good at sleight of hand, or at least somewhat. But this episode opens up with Muriel actually cleaning up the laundry, and somebody off screen ominously stating that he can work with that. At which point Muriel comes in and has since folded the laundry and Courage is now snuggling up on her lap when suddenly there's a knock on the door, which panics Courage a little bit. So he and Muriel actually go to investigate, and they discover a present on the front porch, which Courage is excited about. And Muriel remarks that she isn't entirely sure where it actually came from, but he's more than welcome to open it. At which point Courage opens it up, and it's revealed to be a magic set. A Mondo Magic set, which Courage then proceeds to put on the top hat and magic wand and decides to start doing some tricks. He initially tries to make the whole bouquet of flowers thing with the magic wand, but he screws it up and winds up summoning a bouquet of fishes instead, which he then quickly rectifies and then hands to Muriel. With her pointing out how lovely it is, but Eustace isn't very amused by magic tricks, and merely tells Courage to do the trick where he disappears. So Muriel then decides to encourage Courage to keep trying, and tells him to unveil his biggest trick, which he thinks will impress even Eustace. And Courage does. He finds a chest in the bottom of the box labeled "Your Biggest Trick," and then proceeds to pull it out and opens the box, which starts sparkling and making a bunch of magical sparkles and noises. And Courage eventually drops it and runs to cower behind Eustace and Muriel, who are currently both sitting in their chairs. At which point, two giant tigers and two lovely assistants actually pop out of the box, and the assistants rub their fans together to reveal the magician inside the box. And then the magician introduces himself and points out that he's glad everybody is actually there to witness his magic act. But with Eustace just bellyaching about how it's just smoke and mirrors, and that's how all magic tricks are done. But the man merely remarks that that's not how he operates, and that he uses actual magic. And then introduces himself as the titular Mondo, who is indeed the magician. And then he proceeds to actually pull a demonstration to show that he's not all bluff, and has Courage actually assist him with a curtain trick. With using his magic powder, he then sprinkles it behind the curtain, which Courage is a little skeptical at first, because obviously this guy just popped out of a box, and obviously that's very strange. But then the man summons a giraffe from behind the curtain using his magic powder, which makes Courage happy, and Muriel and actually applauds Eustace as less than enthused, because once again remarks that it's just mirrors. But then Mondo actually sprinkles his powder again, and the giraffe turns into a giant tiger, which he then puts a curtain over its head and transforms it into a bird, which is very much impressive, and is a very impressive feat of magic. But Eustace still isn't very impressed. At which point Mondo asks for a volunteer from the audience. And Muriel initially volunteers herself, but Mondo merely remarks that she's got something special planned for her in the future, and that she'll have to stick around for that. But then he asks Eustace to be his volunteer, with Eustace kind of grumbling a little bit at first, and because he doesn't want to. But at Muriel's prompting, he does decide to actually get up and take part in the magic act, and asks for a new flat screen TV since he wants to feel like he's part of the action. And Mondo does indeed do exactly that. Not technically the way Eustace wanted, but he does transport Eustace inside of his TV, which very much lets him become a part of the action. So, yeah, careful what you wish for there, Eustace. And he just kind of, and yeah, Eustace winds up getting into a wrestling match, and Courage is just kind of decides to turn it off because he doesn't want to watch it anymore. At which point Mondo decides to finally showcase his final trick of the evening, and does have Muriel volunteer for it. And then he proceeds to place a magic blanket over her head, and proceeds to sprinkle some powder over it, and then he whips it off. And at first, Courage is a little skeptical and scared because he has no idea what Mondo is planning. But initially, Muriel seems fine. It seems like nothing is actually happening. But then one of her eyes pops out. And which freaks Courage and herself out, and Muriel even remarks that he has no idea what happened to that, and she has never had one of those before. At which point Mondo decides that will conclude their magic trick and proceeds to go to the bathroom. But Courage pulls on his cape to try and get him to reverse what he did, but then it's revealed that that Mondo's human form is actually a costume, and indeed he's some sort of large, scaly turtle thing. Kind of looks a little bit like Bowser, actually, and that does feel very deliberate. But in case Mondo, now having exposed his true form, then reveals his real plan, which is to turn Muriel into another creature that looks exactly like him, and then take her as his bride, which is why he got rid of Eustace in the first place. And Muriel is very concerned about that, and then one of her other eye pops out, and she has eye stalks very similar to Mondo's. And Courage then proceeds to try and figure out what he can actually do to stop it, and actually tries to use some magic himself, but all it really happens is that her nose transforms, and then she breathes fire on him, which causes him to kind of panic and run out of the house. And then later that night, Courage has until midnight to actually fix Muriel, and by this point she's actually almost completely transformed into another monster. But in any case, Mondo merely reassures her that it'll only be a couple of hours until she's fully transformed. At which point he'll have her all to himself. But Courage actually calls Dr. Vindaloo on the phone, who then shows up on an Indian elephant because he's Indian. And then Courage then proceeds to show Dr. Vindaloo what's going on with Muriel, and he tells Courage that there's nothing to worry about because it's just black magic, but he also remarks that it's nothing he can do, which isn't something he said in a long time, but he does point out that the reason there's nothing he can do is because the only way to actually fix Muriel is to fight magic with magic, and with that Mondo turns him into a head of lettuce and he rolls away. At which point they then proceed to move back into the living room, and Courage now realizing he needs to actually use magic to fight back against Mondo and his abilities, decides to actually put a blanket over Muriel's head, and they're currently watching TV. But he pulls a blanket over, and they're also laughing at Muse's torment as well, I should mention as well, because we're watching TV. But Courage then proceeds to put a blanket over Muriel's head and uses his magic wand to try and turn her back to normal, which doesn't work, and she merely roars at him and knocks him off the couch, showcasing that she's just very, very far gone at this point. But Mondo then proceeds to mock him, pointing out that he needs to get real, and that he's not going to be and that he's not going to be able to undo it in the hour he has left. So Courage then decides to actually demonstrate with one of his techniques, and he doesn't really have a trick. He does that whole changing your expression by hiding your face kind of thing, where you do that thing. But in any case, that's enough to actually confound Mondo, who doesn't fully understand how Courage is actually doing it. And even she pulls out a mirror to actually try and do it himself, but while not fully understanding how it works. At which point, Courage actually proceeds to sweat some of Mondo's magic powder and tries to transform Muriel back, with Mondo retaliating by transforming her back into a monster as well. So he turns her. So they wind up having a bit of a transformation contest with at one point Dr. Vindaloo just shows up as one of the transformations, and he's just like, I am no longer a head of lettuce, but then he transforms back into a head of lettuce. But in case, after doing that for a couple of minutes, Mondo then proceeds to continue to mock Courage for his presentation, and points out that he's been working for years to actually make himself a presentable magician, pointing out that that presentation is the key to any good magic performance, and that Courage only has 4 minutes, which I call shenanigans. It hasn't been anywhere near an hour yet, but in case he then mocks Courage for his transformation sequence. At which point Courage then proceeds to actually put on an actual full-on magic stage where he actually puts curtains in the living room, proceeds to pull a duck out of his hat, which impresses Muriel, which impresses Monster Muriel and Mondo a little bit. At which point Courage then proceeds to pluck a feather from the duck's ass and tickles his own nose, which causes him to sneeze. And then he sneezes the magic powder all over Mondo and Muriel. Muriel returns back to normal, whereas Mondo turns back into a rabbit. And Mondo then proceeds to leave out the front door, but then proclaims that the two of them will hear from his agent, and then he leaves. At which point they then proceed to watch TV again. Eustace is still very much stuck on the TV, and is unable to actually get out. At which point Courage decides to pull one last magic trick and uses his hat to actually pull Eustace out of the TV and save him. And that's how the episode ends. So yeah, this episode's kind of interesting in that Courage actually picks up some magic skills in this episode. He has to do so to save Muriel, who is turning into a large, oversized Koopa. But it is kind of interesting. Courage actually winds up getting into a magic contest with an actual magician / alien turtle thing, and it winds up working out in Courage's favor. And I very much like that like this episode. It's just Courage picking up magic and actually learning how to be a pretty good, decent magician in the process. I do like this episode. But in any case, that's my review of Mondo Magic. Onward to the next review. Okay, so this episode, Watch the Birdies, is actually very interesting in that Muriel winds up being a babysitter for a bunch of baby birds. And that's kind of how the episode is set up. It starts off with Muriel actually feeding a bunch of bluebirds outside the farm. Courage is avoiding the birds because, as he stated in a previous episode, birds make fun of him and he doesn't really like them all that much. But Muriel tries to reassure him that there's nothing wrong going on with the birds. And at which point she hears Eustace hollering inside her for dinner and for breakfast, and that he wants somebody to feed him because, as he states, he's dying of starvation, which may or may not be true. But Muriel merely remarks that she's merely feeding the birds, and then also once again reassures Courage that nothing as bad is going to happen because there's a bunch of birds, and birds aren't really scary. But then she's picked up by a giant vulture and carried off. At which point Courage freaks out and tries to tell Eustace what went on, but Eustace just ignores him and then scares him with his Ooga Booga mask, which causes Courage to just run out of the house. At which point he then proceeds to follow the vulture up to its nest. It is in a very tall tree, and Courage is forced to climb all the way up. At which point he does eventually reach the top of the nest, where it's revealed why the vulture actually kidnapped Muriel. Because as it turns out, we meet the vulture. She is a loving mother of 3. And long story short, she just wants somebody. She doesn't have a husband to help take care of her baby birds. So she kidnapped Muriel to be a babysitter until she gets back, because she's currently going to a singles mixer to actually pick up a guy and actually come back home with a possible husband, so that they can actually have a parent, so that she doesn't need to kidnap somebody again to babysit her baby birds. And the mother vulture merely tells Muriel that she hopes they'll be delightful darlings for her, and Muriel assures her that there shouldn't be any problem with the vulture responding that if anything does happen, that she'll eat her alive, which Courage then freaks out over, because he realizes they need to keep the baby bird safe or Muriel will get eaten. At which point the mother vulture actually gives her farewells to her kids and Muriel, and then proceeds to fly off and presumably go to pick up guys. At which point, shortly after, the baby birds actually start crying for food. And Muriel noting that Courage actually followed her up the actually followed her up the tree and into the nest. Actually, he tells Courage to actually go and get them some food so that they can actually feed the baby birds. And Courage does exactly that, even though he's a little upset that he had to climb all the way up there just to climb all the way back down. But he doesn't need to do that. He climbs back down, but he actually slips and loses his footing, so he actually winds up sliding down the tree and hurting himself a little bit. But in any case, he then proceeds to go back to the farmhouse to actually prepare a breakfast for the baby birds, and he actually prepares escargot for them, like a very fancy meal of snails for them. And Eustace becomes upset with Courage because Courage actually sets it all up on the kitchen table, and Eustace initially thinks that the snails are for him, and is very upset when it actually turns out not to be his breakfast. But in any case, Courage then proceeds to bring the tray of snails back up to Muriel, but he quickly finds out that he can't climb the tree and hold the tray in his hands at the same time, so he balances it on his tongue and proceeds to climb up the tree that way. And then he proceeds to bring the meal to them, but the birds don't want any of the snails or escargot. And Muriel explains that snails actually don't eat baby birds actually don't eat snails. They eat worms, which is ironic because they do eat snails. But in any case, he then proceeds to Courage upset that he had made all of this food for them, and now it kind of went away to nothing. First and foremost, he eats the food himself, and then proceeds to climb back down, and actually goes digging for some worms in the immediate vicinity, and eventually comes back with a whole pile of them, which he's a little disgusted by, but he does decide to actually climb up the tree. But he has to climb up the tree the same way he did with the tray, and actually uses that to actually puts the snails on his tongue to balance them, and then climbs up. And at which point he brings the worms to the baby birds, but which Muriel tries to feed them, but the baby birds, it quickly becomes apparent that the baby birds don't know how to chew their food yet, because they're little babies. So Muriel then proceeds to explain this to Courage, who realizes what this means, and is a little less enthusiastic to do it. But what he does is he winds up putting the worms in his mouth and starts chewing them, and tries not to vomit. At which point he sticks his tongue out, and the baby birds just peck it off of his tongue, and winds up hurting his tongue in the process. But Muriel is very happy that he actually did wind up feeding the birds after all, which Courage just gives her a thumbs up because he has nothing else better to say. But in any case, afterwards they then proceed to just kind of relax and take in the view while the baby birds actually play, and Muriel actually stops to enjoy the sound of the baby birds playing, which Courage agrees is very pleasant. But then he realizes what the baby birds are actually playing with, and as it turns out, they're playing monkey in the middle with the bee's nest, which is very dangerous. So Courage actually intervenes, stops the mid game, and actually takes the bee's nest from them and replaces it back on the branch where they found it. But in the process, he accidentally angers the bees, which attack him, and then he falls off the tree and gets stung by bees. So he winds up falling off the tree, hurting himself, then getting stung by bees, and then he proceeds to climb back up the tree, now badly injured and with a few broken bones. At which point Muriel responds that the baby birds are hungry again, and tells Courage to actually go and find some bait from Eustace's fishing stash. Pointing out that he actually has a bucket of bait that he uses for when he goes fishing, and that the baby birds would likely enjoy a snack from that. So Courage actually climbs down the tree and into the bait, and goes into the bag's basement to actually go get the bucket of worms, while Eustace comes out once again complaining about how he's hungry. And when he sees Courage making off with his bucket full of bait, he then proceeds to chase after Courage, who runs as fast as he can back to the tree, but in the process he winds up tripping and dropping the bait everywhere, and actually has to clean it up. But however, this winds up causing conflict, because in the process 3 of the worms actually wind up sliding down into a snake's nest, and Courage accidentally puts the snake into the bucket of bait along with the actual bait. At which point Eustace then resumes his chase, and Courage winds up being chased back up the tree, now having to balance the bucket full of worms on his tongue and having to climb up like he's been doing. At which point he then gets in the process of actually chewing up their food for them so he can actually feed them, and then he winds up pulling the snake out of the bucket by accident, and he realizes what he's done. At which point he then proceeds to spit out the food in the snake's face and proceed to cower behind Muriel and the baby birds. At which point the snake reveals itself to not only be sentient, but also is very keen on the fact that he gets to now eat a snack of baby birds. And even not so subtly calls them breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because there's 3 of them. But he then proceeds to go in and tries to eat them. Meanwhile, Eustace has since figured out what's going on, or at least he's figured out that Muriel is actually in the nest and proceeds to climb up after her. At which point Courage tries to defend Muriel and the baby birds from the snake, who is currently trying to eat the baby birds. So he picks up the bee's nest that he had so carefully put back on the branch and proceeds to throw it at the snake, who ducks, but in the process he winds up hitting Eustace with it, who had just climbed up the tree and to join them, and winds up getting covered in honey and feathers because they're currently in a bird's nest as well. And when the snake actually lunges to go after the baby birds, Courage actually intervenes by placing himself in the snake's jaws and actually holding them open. At which point Eustace now looks like a bird, is getting stung by bees, so he flaps his arms like a bird as he runs away from the bees. And this attracts the snake's attention, who believes that Eustace is the baby bird's mother and chases after him instead, after throwing Courage aside and getting rid of him. At which point Eustace proceeds to leap out of the nest, barely being able to fly for a minute before falling down to the bottom, and the snake chases after him, and then they run off into the sunset. At which point the baby bird's mother vulture actually returns, and she remarks that the singles mixer was actually kind of a bust, and she wasn't able to actually find a guy there. But while she was on her way home, she actually did find a guy and introduces the baby birds to their new daddy, which turns out to be Eustace, because again, he looks like a bird. She didn't know the difference. At which point Eustace demands of Courage to know where his dinner is, and Courage just spits up some chewed up worms and tells him and kind of just offers them to Eustace. So yeah, this episode is just kind of interesting, in that Muriel actually just wound up being a babysitter for a bunch of baby birds, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a very interesting episode. I mean, it's a little bit surreal because the baby birds are very big, and also the vulture is kind of very big as well. But overall, there's nothing. It's just a very wholesome episode. There's the bit at the end where the snake tries to eat the babies, but other than that, it's actually a very wholesome episode of Courage and Muriel trying to help raise baby birds, while the mother is out looking for a parent to actually help her raise the baby birds. But yeah, it is a very cute episode. I do very much like this episode. This episode's a lot of fun. But yeah, that's gonna do it for my review of Courage the Cowardly Dog. What did you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well if you want to help support the show and also want to see more projects like this big one that I'm doing for October. Then be sure to check that out down in the description. And also, if you want to see more content from me, then there's actually 2 ways you can do that. One is by checking out my Twitch down in the description, and I do recommend you do that because in addition to streaming horror games every Sunday until for the rest of Courage Month, we're actually going on to do a watch along of Straight On Nowhere, Courage the Cowardly Dog meets Scooby-Doo, which is gonna be interesting and fun, and I hope you guys will actually join me for that. And also, if the other way you actually can help support me by watching more content from me is by checking out the videos linked in the end screen. The top video is the most recent one. It may or may not be this one. Whereas the bottom video is the video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. So, if you want to try something new, or see more of what you like, then be sure to check both of those videos out. But, regardless of whether or not to do any of those things, thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!